Yikes.
Whoops.
Lost everything.
Why? Uh-oh.
Oh, you don't want to know.
How come the Saskatoon screen's not coming?
Hello, Mandy.
Was that?
Oh,
there we go.
Well, why can't we make our screen bigger? Like, it just won't.
We had it big earlier.
I know. Well, now it won't let me again. See, I screwed it up by going and learning about the system. I should just.
So what is it you're trying to do? Do we need to call Amanda?
You're just a tiny box.
Oh.
We had it bigger earlier. Now it's back to tiny boxes.
I think it is because we're on a Zoom call. So all the participants on a Zoom call will show up as individual boxes. But the main thing I think that you need to be concerned with is whatever is on Murray's iPad, right? Because that's the content that he shares with you guys.
The only thing is when we can't really see it, just sometimes it makes it harder to hear. I know that sounds dumb, but I'm kind of a lip reader.
Okay. Sure.
Let's see here. Video settings, let's see. Ooh, we could touch up our appearances.
So you guys are sharing that computer screen with us. I don't know if that was on purpose or not.
That's what I'm wondering. We click share.
Can
you stop the share? That red button there.
Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Yay!
Yeah, I told you share.
We don't like to share.
We like the big button. Erin just ruined our. We can get rid of the little tiny. Let's just leave it. Why is she so screwed that?
Pearson talk about? It's too costly, just don't change it.
That's right. It costs too much money.
Just leave it.
This is a terrible
Status
system.
quo, status quo.
It's a terrible system, but we like it the way it is.
We've learned the material. We can relate it
To real life.
That's what Professor Fulton wants us to do.
Perfect. That could be our essay about it.
So I haven't sent the summary yet for the readings that we have.
The extra?
I have finished the reading. It's a very nice one. But what I was thinking is that probably what we need to do is try to, after we're going to have Friday, probably for our next meeting, we pick like a subject, like for example, taking Michael's readings, and then try to go through concepts, especially for the ones that we don't have this extra pattern. So saying like, okay, so decision making sense, or Simon, let's take Herbert Simon. What's he say? What are his contributions, and who contradicts him, and who says something different? What's that? Because for the exam, we will need that. Especially, or for example, with the exam, it's going to be something like problem sets that we're having now, or the assignments that Michael used to do that. It will be easier to have all the information. Hey, Susie! Hi!
are you?
How are you?
Thanks. Oh, you're so cool.
I know, it's terrible out. Better than the weekend though.
Hey, look what they left over there. Here, it's
Ooh.
strange. There's
No, it's not. It's come from your student association.
Oh,
To
awesome.
help you get through the week of this Valentine's Day.
And you are a member of the student association.
I am.
So it's
Oh,
really nice
thank
that
you,
can
classmate.
Look at you go.
Are you the president, Larry?
No, I'm VP. This is my candy bag and I'm walking around with everything.
Wow. Is that for us?
Yeah. There's fruit shake.
Mike, there's lollipops and chocolate. You want some? You sure?
There's peanut butter ones, cream-filled ones, caramel ones.
Once people get involved in it, you may not have a chance.
Thank you.
So, Mike, you look identical to my half brother. It's crazy.
Oh.
Like,
Talking to me?
pardon?
You talking to me?
Yeah, you, Mike. It's,
How old is he?
he is, let's see, 36.
Because there used to be a guy that went around looking like me back in the day, and I used to see him at the bar. Same guy, and he was about 4 years younger than me.
My half brother is not really, is not like a far guy.
This is like 20 years.
No, even then, he was like, I was more the go out kind of gal, and he was totally like just into computers and remote. Yeah, really, truly. It's like, we just did not get each other.
What's his name?
William Fiddler. Yeah.
Relation to Chrissy Fiddler?
Chrissy Fiddler would be. But I don't know Christy very well. Like, so my half brother grew up here in Regina, but I grew up with my mom in LA.
Okay.
So I only know Christy.
Just high school.
Oh yeah.
I haven't seen her for a few years, but
Is she from PA originally?
I think they're from Ontario. So, because they're like ranchers, I think, or now she lives out by Bethune with their parents.
Yeah, there's kind of a whole bunch of different. LA group, PA group, Saskatoon group.
Hey.
Hello.
How's everyone?
Oh yeah.
Fine. How are you? Good. Oh. I walk here.
Get used to that.
What are you talking about?
Pregnancy is fine.
What are you talking about? Fine.
All those people who tell you like,
Oh, it's so magical.
dynamite, you're a liar. And
Yeah, don't ask me. I was telling you the other day, right?
no, that's last.
Oh,
Actually, the best advice I ever got was from It's like, what?
Yeah, she said she was so tired.
That's also true.
if you're trying now, wait.
Walking that whole party.
She's pretty good at dudes, frankly.
What? You have a page?
I do ask, so. It's kind of random.
It's like working at the horse house. It's actually very nice, but a bit of work. Probably we should ask her because we need, because there's a lot of stuff that's all needs.
Like a gift card or something, maybe?
Yeah.
Just throw money out.
Yeah, they, I mean, they moved here and they just, so I can't imagine that. She's had it for forever. Stroller and.
Well, 6 of 1.
When my wife was pregnant with her first one, well, we're both, but we were living in the Arctic at the time.
Oh.
So she came to stay with her parents for the last 6 weeks because the airlines won't fly.
Right, yeah.
6 weeks pregnant. So she left early July. Allie was born August 5th, so I didn't. So the last 6 weeks she was pillows and raped, and she had
Gestational diabetes.
Oh.
she put on 80 pounds
Oh.
during her pregnancy. I show up. Nothing. Other than I'm in the bed that night and she said pillows all over the place. You know what? I'm just going. And 22 hours later. Pardon me?
That can make the baby grow really quickly.
Well, it's really because I have my sister, right? She just had her second baby. She went into labor. Gave her back
All right,
now.
folks, we're just about ready. It takes me a while here to get all my.
22 hours. And then the C-section.
Hey.
And poor Ellie's head was just caving. No, I can't.
You're telling me all this story.
Yeah.
It is what-
Blocking.
it is what it is, right?
It's better to know the truth before.
Yeah.
Then you don't.
Probably like somewhere in between the 22 hours and the 15 minutes, like a nice middle ground.
Yeah. Somewhere in there would be good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Stay a little. For about 45 minutes from our hospital. So.
Well, that's not gonna work.
No, we gotta be.
Regina, can you see my high?
Yeah, there are the screens are actually popping up in the middle of your high, so I'm gonna try to fix it.
All right.
You watch it?
Andy, thank you. All right. Welcome back, everyone. We've got lots of things to do today. I think we should probably start with the little assignment that I gave you, because we haven't got you going on your term papers, and I think that that's a good idea. And I know one of the questions from last time, Julian, you wanted to ask about the final, so we should talk about that a little bit as well. But before we talk about the final, is everybody ready to just say something about their term paper and theory that they're thinking about doing? And with all this number of people in the class, we can't be, you can't have 5 minutes. You can have 30 seconds. and then we'll see how this goes. So who wants to go first? Okay.
So I'm planning on looking at the factors that control the supply of dentists in Canada.
Can't hear you. We can't hear you.
So the factors that are controlling the supply of dentists in Canada. So I think it's a balance between the regulators, or the licensing authorities, the professional associations, and dental schools. And so I think it's a principal agency problem at its heart, but I'm still learning some theory, so we'll see.
So I'm going to give my quick comments, and part of this is so that you can, you might find that you can adjust what you're going to say as you go along. So what's my quick question, my quick comment would be, and so I'm just going to be quite kind of just jump in and be quite upfront about this. What's your political economy question? How does this fit into a political economy course? It's too general to say, look at the factors that influence supply. What you would want to do, I think, is turn this around and say, I think that pick a group, the professional association has an impact, and it does this through some kind of political, economic, blah, blah, blah. Okay? Do you see how you just turn that and make it something that is about political economy very explicitly, and you turn a very general question like what are the supplies into a specific question drawing with a specific sort of target that you then can say, I know where I could go and look for the theory. So principal agent theory, there's an element of political economy in there, but I think you saw from Mo that he actually questions whether that's really a political economy question. And unless it is about how do you achieve the cooperation between the principal and the agent. But simply having a principal-agent problem isn't enough. What's the question that, let me put it this way, and all of you can be thinking about this. What's the question that you now start to see a way of addressing a question and coming up with an answer that you could not have seen without the theories that you've taken in this class?
Then I would say
Speak up, I think you have to.
So I would change that now to our professional dental associations involved in limiting the number of dentists who are allowed to practice. Okay. So theory-wise, I would still have to look into which one applies best. But I think there could be some cooperation aspect to it, and kind of which aspects they interfere with or not.
Okay, and so let me just throw out a couple of other things you might look at. What would be the role of, how did they institutionalize that power? What did they do within the larger profession to make them so that there was a norm that people had to be professionalized? Now, this is, of course, being done by other professions, and it was being done much, a long time in the past. But think about, or what's being done to sustain that professionalization aspect. Think of a profession as an institution, or the idea of a profession as an institution. Okay, does that help?
Yeah.
Perfect. Aaron, or who? Let's go to Regina. Somebody from Regina.
Marie, before we start, you'll have to click your iPad off. Otherwise, the only thing we see is hi in between, and unless you're showing it. There. Thanks.
You are welcome. Who would like to go from Regina?
I can go.
Perfect.
In my day job, I'm the CEO at SUMA, so my question is going to be around why in 2019 municipalities that are, shall we say, dying, not viable, why have they not entertained the an amalgamation with their municipalities around them. And I know Professor Bolton, your colleague, I think it's Professor Archea, wrote a fairly significant paper back in the 90s, and that didn't go over very well in the political world. So I know it's very politically charged. And so I want, using these theories that we've learned in your class, I have a better understanding now, perhaps, as to why. So I'd like to write about that.
Okay, so a fabulous question. As you say, it's age old. Before Joe wrote his paper, Rose Olfert and Jack Stabler wrote a couple of pieces. I was involved in the first of those, and then they wrote a separate piece that is also, I think, relevant to this. Great question. Why aren't these rural municipalities moving to do something in the light of a non-sustainable kind of situation? Remember what I said in my note to you was I want you to pick one theory. What would be the one? Because I don't want you to say, it could be a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of this. I don't want, this is to everyone, okay? I do not want you to do what you would often do in an undergrad thesis, and that is to say, well, such and such a theory would help explain this, but so would this, and so would this, and so would this, where what you were trying to do is to impress that you kind of learned from the textbook or whatever, this theory, this theory, this theory, and this theory, but at the end, you never knew any of them really well. You just knew what their names were, and I'm slightly exaggerating. You kind of knew what their names were of what this theory was, but you really didn't understand the mechanisms that were at work. I need you to understand the mechanisms that are at work in a particular theory, and so I want you to pick just one. So, my question to you is, which one theory? And by the way, as all you're listening to this, you should be thinking, if I had to choose one theory, what would it be? And I'm going to come back, because this is a great one. I'm going to just quickly ask the rest of you, what would you choose as the one theory? See if he gets it right.
But Professor, my 30 seconds are up, so I can't really answer your question. I guess I'm stalling. I haven't really decided yet. So unless subject to any suggestions any one of you have, I'm much willing to do that, but I haven't picked one out yet.
What's one of your candidates?
Pardon me?
What is one of the candidates in mind?
In the communities, you mean?
No, as a theory.
Oh, gosh. Wow, the paper I just handed to you yesterday, I wrote a little bit about it in that particular context. So I guess I could use the four characteristics that Pearson or wrote about. I suppose I could do that, but I'm sorry, I can't really pick one off the top here.
Well, group. What else came to mind? He was suggesting path dependence. Any other theories that would suggest a reason for why a group like these are municipalities, these are local governments in small towns or regions of Saskatchewan, and they are too small to govern. They don't have a big enough tax base anymore. Why don't they amalgamate with people next to them and form one large one, I'll say, out of 4 or 5, rather than just one?
The city is a group machine that.
What? Just very quickly, and then we're going to go on to the next one. If that's the problem, what theory have we taken that would say, I want to look at that? Anybody?
What about game theory?
But which part of game theory?
I don't know. Tit for tat?
So is it a cooperation game or is it a coordination game?
Cooperation, coordination, whatever.
No, that doesn't work. This is where you have to be precise. but they're not cooperating.
Exactly. So can that be explained through some sort of?
Looking towards getting into a cooperation sort of scenario, right? So the barrier to that would be the problem.
Okay, so this might, if you want to think about these groups needing to get together but they're not, then maybe the problem is in fact a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, but then, okay, then you have to think that through as to whether that actually works. Are all the elements for a prisoner's dilemma at work? Is there kind of anonymity amongst the groups? Is there no potential for long-term discussions and ongoing behavior? None of those seem to work. And those are all the conditions that actually tend to tip prisoners' dilemmas into getting cooperation, is if you have the ability to communicate long-term relationships, these kinds of things.
What about Ostrom's 8 design principles? Wouldn't it apply in this situation?
So this would be why they don't get applied, right?
Okay.
So there might be something from Ostrom's design principles. Okay. Anyone else?
I was thinking maybe the article, the Mollash article about the city as a growth machine, about political economy of place.
Okay. There might be, though here it seems to be that it's the opposite, that they're not actually striving for growth. Right? So somehow it seems to be the opposite of what Mollash is talking about. And now, we could explore that more, or maybe it's a lack of, maybe if you take his view, it's a lack of a sense of the elites in one group to have any connection with the land in the other surrounding areas, and so they have no interest at all in doing some kind of amalgamation because they don't. It's not part of their circle, and so you have a system of elites that are actually separated from each other. The land has been too segmented. Is there another point, Regina?
Yeah, Lauren just got a point here, not to put her on the spot. But.
Oh, well, no, but I can. Laurie.
I was just saying that it depends on if the amalgamation is rural to rural or rural to urban. If it's rural to urban, then the city as a place of growth, my article/theory might apply, but if it's rural to rural, then I'm not sure you could find a connection.
Yeah, but remember what we're trying to explain is the lack of them getting together. So this is the question. What gives us a lack? Okay. This is so. Think back. We could start with Coast and say, here are these 4 municipalities. There is an arrangement. I mean, the belief is that there's an arrangement, and this is what of the study that Joe Garcia did and my colleagues Rose and Jack did. They said, if you could actually get together, you'll make the pie bigger. And yet, they don't seem to be doing this. Okay? So, Coast would say, gee, in the absence of transaction costs, they would get together and come up with this agreement. They'd figure this out. But nothing's happened. And in fact, nothing's happened, not just right now, but nothing's happened for the last. This has been an issue. Joe talked about it in the late 90s. Rose and Jack talked about it in the early 90s. It's been talked about in this province since the early 1960s. This is going on for 50 years. This isn't yesterday. It's been going on for 50 years. So this is deep-seated institutional. So this is a great topic, by the way. There's a deep-seated institutional sort of force going on here, and we I think that's what you need to explore. So I think any of these topics, any of these theories would be good. You need to pick one. The one that would come to mind would be something around path dependence. This is the one where you get this lock-in to a structure, a belief system. And can you think about this as a belief system, for instance, or a set of norms about how municipal governments actually should be run, and what it means to be a reeve of a municipality or a leader, a councillor in one of these municipalities? Does that at all provide an image of something that would allow them to take on other groups? So there's some thoughts. Who's next? I know this is terrible stuff. I'm putting you guys on the spot like you've never been put on the spot in this class.
I'll go.
Hi. My research question is a causal one. Did the dictatorial regime affect the economic growth of Pakistan? A comparative analysis of two eras.
Okay, whoa. Slow down, first of all, because I'm having trouble hearing you across the room. Secondly, way too much detail. What's the problem?
I'm just finding the effect on economic growth of dictatorial regime.
But this is territorial regime. I have no idea what this means.
Dictatorial. Yes.
Dictatorial.
Like.
Okay. But I got you. There's a dictatorial regime. This seems to me to be a really big question.
So I'm just narrowing it down, like I'm taking one dictatorial regime from 1999 to 2007 and one democratic regime which would be from 2008 to 2013 in Pakistan.
Okay.
So the theoretical concept I'm going to use to examine the question is the theory presented in a book, Why Nation Fails, written by Darren Asmoglu.
Okay, yeah.
I will compare these two eras and will find the statistical significance of the economics and social indicator in each era.
Okay, so let me stop you. The purpose of this paper is not to provide statistical existence of a difference. You may wish to bring that in to say that there is a difference. Okay? What this course is about isn't to do, and that's an important part of the research, don't get me wrong, okay? Because you do need to be able to say there was a difference in the outcome of this regime compared to this regime. Okay? You do need to be able to say that. But this course is not about saying that there is a difference between them.
Okay.
This course is about what?
About political economy?
Obviously, but in the context of this problem, what would it be about? It's about saying, why is this the case? How could we directly link a dictatorial regime in this period to either better or poorer performance? And then what is the mechanism by which that occurs? Okay. And it isn't enough to say, oh, we got good performance under a dictator or poor performance under a dictator. It's why did a dictator have this kind of an outcome? And you need a theory for that.
And the book Why Nation Fail is based on two major theories, right?
What are they?
The first explains the drivers of democratic and dictatorial regimes, and the second part is explained.
Okay, but let me stop you again. I'm going to do this with everyone. You can't say, you have not told me what the theory is. You've told me what it tries to explain, but you haven't told me what the theory is.
It explains how democratic
No, stop. Anything that says a theory explains isn't a story of the theory. The theory is, this is the behavior that is, these people put in this situation will behave in this particular way for these particular reasons with this particular outcome. That's a theory. A theory is not, it looks at this question. That is not a theory. What's the theory?
But I got it. It's just it's trying to say like democratic regime promote economic growth while dictatorial regime prevent it.
But why? What's the mechanism? You think about this, we'll come back to this, okay? Who's next?
Can I?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm just trying to see how China's Belt and Road Initiative will affect future trade with United States.
Okay.
And I'm trying to look at it through the lens of, I think, today's article, Heschman's interpretation of influence of, influence effect of foreign trade. I'm trying to just look at how that applies to this Belt and Road Initiative of China.
Okay, so let me ask you. There's certainly a question there. Okay, why not go closer and ask? I mean, to me, if you wanted to make the connection with Hirschman, what's the obvious question that you would ask about China's Belt way? What's the obvious question? By the way, does everybody know what the question is? Does everybody know what China's Beltway is?
The BRI initiative, where China is trying to connect, I think close to, so they're trying to build a connection and influence their trading with Europe, Asia, and some part of Africa.
Right.
So then they're expanding that network and trying to build that infrastructure across, like, I think 72 countries or so. Yeah, so then
Some crazy.
It's going to give them that economic power to be able to affect their trade, I guess. I mean, I have to go into much detail. But then I'm just currently with the trade.
No, you're okay.
So I'm just trying to look at what is happening now with regards to how trade is happening with the United States. Obviously, those are the two largest economies and all the stuff that's going in there. And how, if this happens, because this is an initiative that has started, but it hasn't been completed yet. But in the view that this is completed, what's going to happen? How is this going to change the dynamics with regards to trade with the United States?
Okay, so very clear. You can just leave that on. Let me ask everyone, would that be the first, if you think about the Beltway that China's building, what would be the first question that you would ask about that Beltway if you thought about Hirschman's article today? What would be the first question that would come into mind? Political power for China. And specifically vis-a-vis all the countries that are being connected by the Beltway. So, Esther, my comment back to you is, why jump to the United States? Why not think about what you said earlier, just a moment ago? You said the Beltway will increase China's economic power, or China's power. Why? How? How does the Beltway actually increase China's power? It seems to me that you have to ask that question first before you can ask the question about how it's going to interact with the United States. You have a premise that you're taking for granted that I think you actually need to ask the question, how does this affect? Obviously, China thinks it's going to increase their power. Why would it? Does it make sense given what Hirschman and others, Mo, are telling us about power? Does that Beltway actually accomplish that?
Okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, it does.
Okay. I'm going to go to Regina. I know I'm terrible. I'm putting every one of you on the spot.
I'll go.
Okay.
Just want to look at basically digital currencies and the mining associated with it. Basically, look at that, what kind of economic theories can explain how to change the amount of miners within the digital currency space. So probably coasts or something like that.
Yeah, so Mike and I have talked about this one a little bit. So I've got a bit of advantage in that I've actually thought about this a little bit. It seems to me that I think COAS is a good framework to think about this, because if you think about one of the things that digital currencies are being touted for is to actually help parties exchange goods and services, okay, and they can do that with with the knowledge that the information that's being passed about the product and the price and all of this is absolutely secure. That there's no question about its authenticity. Okay, so that's one of the things that digital currency offers up. Now, so this should enable. I think this is what it's being touted. It should enable a buyer and a seller to now transact with a much higher degree of trust, which should lower the transaction costs between these two parties. But I think Mike, the question you and I got asking was, are those people actually paying the full cost of these digital currencies in terms of including the mining? If not, why is digital currency actually its use predicated on the environmental costs, that cost of mining not being reflected in the price that people have to pay? So how much of the sort of euphoria around these currencies is because people think, I could have this secure transaction at very little cost to me, without realizing that there's actually a much higher cost, and why isn't that cost actually being built in to those goods? Because we would think that it should be, if COAS is right at all, that those higher costs should be built in, and yet they don't seem to be factored into the price that people that would be doing these trades would actually be considering. Okay. Does that fit with what we were saying before, Mike?
A little bit, yeah. I've been thinking about it too, and there's a lot of kind of considerations like the mining difficulty changes over time. So if you increase the cost, whether it's through carbon credits or whatever, it could actually increase the price of Bitcoin, which would increase the speculative fervor, which would drive up use and demand. So there's a whole bunch of things you'd have to think about and try to figure out the logic, I guess, within a certain economic.
Yeah. So, I think what you're going to have to do is really narrow this question down. And by the way, this goes for everybody. You'll find this isn't. Everybody was going to have to narrow your topic down in order to make this doable. All right, back to Saskatoon here. Who's next?
Can I go?
Sure.
So should we think about Canadian pipeline issue as country rather than individual groups, that is provinces or indigenous groups? So the theory I want to use is Coase theorem, and I just want to look at what are the implications if property rights are assigned to the federal government or they're assigned to these groups, like in the sense of feasibility, like is it possible if the property rights are not with the federal government because the transaction costs are pretty high? So in that regard.
Okay. I think the pipeline issue is a really good example of the assignment of property rights. I think this is one really useful way to think about that problem. What I would say is, again, you're going to have to narrow this topic quite a bit. One of the questions, let me go back to Coase. Coase says, and he's very, very clear about this. He says there's a clear assignment of property rights. Either the confectioner gets it, or the doctor gets the property right. Or the farmer gets it, or the rancher gets it. Or the railway has it, or the landlord with land next to the railway. Okay? The courts, in Coase's world, the courts make the decision, and it's clear. In the pipeline question, we're back at that stage that we were sketching out last week, where the property rights are unclear, and people are fighting over which way the property rights are going to be assigned. And once you've assigned them, they have very different outcomes depending upon who gets the assignment. Okay? So I think you actually need to think about, you might want to think about that first stage rather than assuming that you're going to be in the second stage with property rights already clearly defined.
No, it was basically for me, it was what are the implications of assignment of these property rights to one party or the other in terms of transaction cost and its feasibility. That was my...
But one would, there might be a difference here. I expect that the transaction costs are pretty much the same regardless of who gets the property rights. The cost then of subsequently getting an agreement may not be very much different depending upon who gets the property rights.
But it does change the feasibility depending on who gets the property rights, right?
Not if the costs are the same. Okay. It may depend upon what happens to the project or not.
Yeah, that's what I meant, the feasibility of the project itself. Like whether it happens or not. Like.
Okay, okay. That's a different argument, but fair enough. Feasibility is something about the economic.
Okay, I'll probably find a better word for it, but that's what I meant. Like, is it possible to make this project happen if we give the rights to the federal government or if we give it to these individual groups?
But yeah, and so let me just say, is that really an interest? Is the reason I'm asking is that an interest? Is that a question that really we want to know? Because you're making the assumption that we want this pipeline to go through, and so if you wanted it to go through, then we know who to sign the property rights to. Sign it to the company. That's the answer. But is that the question that you want? Do you want to know what would it take to get it so that it would go through? It seems to me that you've decided the question. You've taken all the interesting stuff out, which is, okay, there's a real political battle here going on between these parties as to who gets the property rights with some very, very important consequences. And it seems to me you've missed that part. Who's next? Aaron.
So the question I've come up with is equal. Oh, no, So the question I want to ask is equalization fair? And this comes out of the last couple of years. There have been Western politicians that have once again been making the criticism that the program is not fair, that it particularly favors Quebec and frequently Ontario. So I have a notion to approach this with theories of institutional change, although I need to spend more time with those so I know specifically what it is I want to use and how I want to use it and how it can be used. Because a big problem with this, because hardly anybody writes on equalization, is going to know what sources of information I can use for this. So.
Okay, so by the way, I think equalization is a fascinating. This is a big institutional question. I think it is a political economy question to the core. I wonder about your question about is it fair?
Can I highlight some sub-questions to flesh that out?
Well, do you think that you could even let's go back to all that debate that we had around can we come up with a social welfare function? Seems to me, under what criteria and is it even relevant in a political economy course to say, what are the relevant criteria for fairness? Is that what you, because that's what you're going to end up having to focus on. Is that what you want to focus on?
So I think so. Yeah, I'm going to move this away. It's very loud. So yes, I think I do want to focus on the question of fairness, and the way I plan to approach it, that is by looking at the original report from which equalization was drawn, as well as the subsequent policy documents as it's changed over the years, and look for which themes of fair. Try to tie the themes within the policy documents to theories of fairness and what constitutes fairness, and see which ones may be present and how they've changed over time.
Okay, so I think that's a great topic. I don't think you can do that in the number of words that we have for this particular assignment.
If I just take critical points, would that be better? I'm thinking like the original document, 1970s, and then Harper's change back in, was it 2008?
I think you would need I think you could, if you had a particular view of fairness, you could test it against that.
So if I were to take the themes of fairness in the original documents and then see how it's changed since then.
Yeah, or you could, we haven't looked at this, but you saw reference to it. Oh, which paper was that? I think it was the Hardin paper on constitutions. He referenced Rawls. So you could take, just to pick one off the top of my head, you could pick a Rawlsian theory of fairness or justice and say, does this fit that? You could go back to those people who took decisions. Did you read Jonathan Haidt's book about the moral elements of choice? Is this for those people who you didn't do this? Okay, Jonathan Haidt has a book called, what's it called? The Moral. Anyway, he has some particular views of what people think are fair. But I think you need a particular. If you're going to do fairness, you need a particular standard against which to do this in the period of time that you've got. You can't be evaluating it against multiple views of fairness. You simply won't have. You won't have time, but more importantly, you won't really understand any of the theories of fairness sufficiently to be able to do the analysis.
Okay. Do you know of a book that might overview some of them, so I can just get a brief view of what some of them are?
I don't.
Okay.
I can give you the Jonathan Haidt one.
Yeah, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, Regina, back to you.
I'll go. I'm interested at looking in the effects of allowing healthcare facilities to conscientiously object to providing legally available care. So in the context of medical assistance in so I was thinking about looking at it as a coordination game where you have physicians who are able to either choose to provide it or not provide it, and then the facility, which currently is also able to make that choice. So if they both coordinate and both decide that they're going to conscientiously object and not provide MAID, then it reduces the transaction costs. But I would argue that if they coordinate on both agreeing to provide it, that it's better outcomes, like increased access, lower transaction costs, versus where they currently are now on kind of the opposite diagonals of, they can each make the decision. So if it's an organization that objects to providing it, but the physicians want to provide it, then there's increased transaction costs. They have to go to a different facility. It's a whole big deal. And then same with the opposite diagonal. So that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, okay. So setting this up as a game between a facility and say the doctors. I think a couple of things come to mind. So I like that idea. couple of things come to mind. You're assuming that you're assuming an outcome that you think is right, that you think is the best one. And it's interesting that you in what you just told us, you have already said, well, the current situation is bad. Well, maybe the current situation, and it's not a coordination. Well, if you actually had the things that you said were the coordination outcomes, the game theory actually says that those would have already one of those would have been arrived at. Okay? So maybe, and I think you need to entertain the idea that the situation that we're in is in equilibrium, and that given the incentives and the payoffs that both the physicians and the clinics of the facilities are facing, that this is where they're ending up. And that you would need some other intervention to break that to get to something that you might think would be better as an outcome. Okay? But I don't think you can go in right now thinking, oh, the current situation is out of equilibrium. If it's been with us for some time, I'm going to go back to the earlier point about the earlier question about the RMs. In that story, if you thought that the RMs not amalgamating was somehow out of equilibrium, then we've been out of equilibrium for 50 years. Well, that doesn't seem right, right? What we're actually thinking is that being not amalgamating in that world was the equilibrium, and you wanted to break that logjam. Maybe in your case, being in equilibrium is being in the situation where you're getting this behavior that isn't very effective. Because remember, you're evaluating this, and this is what makes this a good question. You're evaluating, and in fact, it's the question that Downs starts with at the beginning of his paper that we're to do today. You have what's running through all of political economy is this kind of problem. What's the incentive, for whatever reason, monetary or identity or whatever it is, that individuals have, different individual players, and how does that line up with what we think might be a better outcome? Okay, so the prisoner's dilemma is a very good example of that, where two parties end up, if they're in the prisoner's dilemma, ending up in an outcome that is actually worse off for both of them than they would be. And how do we move out of that into a better outcome? And of course, one of the things is we need a different set of institutions that could support kind of cooperation. Maybe in your case, you might think that you need a set of policies or a different set of norms to have one or both of the clinics and the doctors change their behavior so that they got to a place where it was a better outcome for society. So what you're contrasting is the individual behavior and what people are doing versus the outcome for either society as a whole or for even those two parties somehow thought about together rather than as individuals. So don't assume that the situation that you're in is out of equilibrium. Think about it actually, maybe this is what they're doing because it makes sense for them to do that. And then ask the question, how would you get them to change? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Who else?
Take a shot. I'm still trying to work through a good chunk of this. I was kind of looking at the issue around some of these northern shipping routes that are adversely affecting the kind of hunting and fishing abilities of some of these remote northern communities. And so recently there's been kind of an increase in the voices on these northern communities advocating that they need to make alterations to the shipping routes, either the routes themselves or the pace at which they go, to protect their ability to hunt and fish. So I think there are some obvious connections to coasts. What I was looking at a little bit last night was maybe looking a little bit at why their voice hasn't really been heard for the last, 50-ish years. And I was looking a little bit at the biased pluralism that we touched on this week. So I was playing with that, maybe.
Okay. You, just as a hint, you might also, I think you should pick one of these theories rather than trying to, it would be fine to sort of reference coasts on the way by, but then if you want to. The other one you might think about is using the Baumgartner and Jones reading from this week and saying, these particular because you're right, this is a property right. Who gets to ship at which time? That's a property right kind of issue. That ability to be able to assign the property right gets determined by a policy venue or policy images and policy venues are critical in determining that question. And so you could look at would this particular group be able to switch the venue and the image sufficiently that you might think about some kind of a change occurring.
That's a good tip.
Regina, back to you.
I can go.
Sure.
What I'm really interested in is trauma-informed social policy. And how do we shift systems of care, like in healthcare, social work, that's my background that I've studied in and work in. How do we shift those systems to be more trauma-informed? So I don't really know what...
Sorry, what's that? Something informed? I just can't catch it.
Trauma-informed?
Trauma-informed, okay.
So I was thinking about institutional theory, but I haven't really thought it through because I feel like there's too many different angles that I could use.
What's trauma-informed?
Trauma-informed, well, it has a theoretical base, but also a practice base. So it's how do we make our settings more conducive to treating people who've experienced trauma and seeing people with addictions or people who are homeless or people who are experiencing other sort of social issues. If we saw them as experiencing trauma and not people with, moral deficiencies or however you want to approach it, if we saw them as people experiencing trauma instead of as bad people or second-class people, how would that change how we interact?
Yeah, so let me, I think there's something here. Let me try this. It seems to me that the kind of political economy question or institutional question is that there is a mindset or a view that is something other than that. Okay? And it seems to me that the first thing that you need to do if you wanted to even begin to think about how you would move to something like trauma-informed would be to understand why the other system, whatever set of norms are in place, why they're in place. What are those other norms? Why are they in place? I don't think you could do anything on moving to trauma-informed until you understand that basic question. And it seems to me that's where I would start.
Okay.
And then you can bring theories of path dependence, for instance, to this questions of identity, so some of these things that are very powerful ways of setting up norms of behavior. I think you have to understand that to realize that that's what you're going to have to overcome if you ever wanted to move to trauma-informed. Rather than say, here's a great idea, how come nobody's doing it? you've heard me on this before. That view is one that we practice way too often, where we come up with a great idea, but we don't recognize all of the obstacles that actually are in the way of moving to that new outcome, that involves some kind of new, it might involve a new equilibrium, which means changing the behavior of a bunch of people. And unless we understand that, we will never be able to make the move. So that's what I would encourage you to do.
Okay, thank you.
Back to this campus.
So I will look at the new tax policies that will be introduced with the federal budget and which allow businesses to write off more expenses in response to U.S. Corporate tax cuts. And these policies impact the budget, and because they will increase the deficit significantly. And my question is, what are the true cognitive elements behind this budgeting decision? Because it contradicts their narrative around fiscal balance that the federal government have had during the past 10 years, maybe.
So you're talking about the Canadian government?
The Canadian government, yeah.
And just a little bit more background for all of us. What's the tax change?
They will allow businesses to deduct more of their expenses in their calculation of corporate tax. So these will reduce the revenues and increase the deficit in the budget. So the federal government had a plan to reduce the deficit. They introduced a balanced budget law in 2015. It lasted only 1 year, but then their approach was to decrease the deficit gradually. And now these new measures will actually increase the deficit. So there is a change in their cognitive institutional approach.
So maybe. You hinted at why they introduced this particular tax measure.
They are trying to compete with, or at least because the U.S. now seems like a better landscape for businesses to.
And precisely why? Yeah, why?
Because of their tax benefits,
and
their rents, their economic.
And precisely it was because of the tax changes that Trump put through just over a year ago.
Yeah.
Right. So it may be that the Canadian government changed its cognitive model. It may also be that if you like, its next best alternative changed, and if it didn't make those changes, they were faced with businesses leaving and having a bigger impact on the deficit than if they made this change, right? In which case they didn't change their cognitive thing at all. It was a change in an outside set of constraint or this outside environment that changed the structure of the decision framework inside Canada. And that, to me, would be the far simpler argument.
It's more an exogenous.
But this relates back to what we were talking about with Mo. The American government with the tax changes that came in effect a year ago fundamentally shifted the attractiveness of the U.S. market and instantly made it more likely that it made the Canadian environment less competitive. And so if the Canadian government didn't do anything, the Canadian business firms would start to migrate across the border. So in order to keep them here and keep at least some of their tax revenue, they had to do something. If I was thinking about tax policy and what probably went on in the finance department, that would be my initial thought. Not that they said, "Oh, we're not caring about the budget deficit anymore." It's holy mackerel, we're still caring about this. If we don't do something, our budget situation is going to be even worse than it is now. So remember, what the U.S. did was, the U.S. was the equivalent of in the tax world, of coming up to somebody on the street and saying, your wallet or your life. They made the next best alternative worse, and we had to react to that. So I open that up because that's an alternative that actually you could explore. But I think you need to think about which theory you might want to think about. Is this fundamentally a question about there was actually a shift in kind of power and influence that the Canadian government had to respond to? Or was it something that Canadians decided to do completely independent, and it was all about, oh, gee, we don't care about the budget anymore? See if you can make something out of that. Does that make sense?
It does. Thanks.
Regina.
I'll go. So the question I have is, there's actually two different ways that I can look at this, so I'm going to do it all in about 60 seconds, and you can tell me which vein you think is the most interesting. In one way, I can look at this with Baumgartner and Jones. So I ask the question, what image of women must be created in the MMIWG Commission's final report in order to move policymakers to act and save lives? So can the release of the report actually capture the attention of public and policymakers long enough to create kind of some rapid change for Indigenous women? Or I can look at something, still using the commission, I could use Pearson to look at whether or not the federal government is stuck on a path dependency kind of path with public inquiries to deal with it because they don't know how to address these complex problems. So we just launch new inquiry after new inquiry after new inquiry, which create these giant tomes that no one actually does anything about after.
Okay, so two very, very different approaches to the same topic. Which one interests you the most?
So that's my problem. They both really interest me. I find the second one more frustrating because, we launch these incredibly expensive commissions, and then it just seems like nothing happens afterward. Although I think the first one, looking at what kind of image we have to create, probably interests me more the most, because I think how Indigenous women are viewed is central to whether or not people are actually going to do something about the fact that, there are, 600, active or unsolved cases, essentially.
Yeah, so I think either of them would work. I think you need to pick one and not get them mixed up too much, because you won't have enough time. This is one comment, and it's not a bias towards. I think you could do something very interesting on either of them. One thing that just comes to mind off the top of my head on the second one, on the kind of path dependence and commissions, is that, remember on the path dependence argument, we talked about adaptive expectations. And what's interesting about the commission side is that that's what anytime a group feels that that there's something that is wrong and that needs to be dealt with, what's interesting is that they are often the ones that are proposing commissions. And so it isn't just the federal government that's ending up supplying a commission, it's also that the groups are demanding commissions. So this seems to me to be something where it's self-reinforcing. There's an expectation that this is how we deal with them, and so it creates this expectation, well, then we have to ask for a commission. And yet, I think you're right. Many of these commissions end up sitting on the shelf and don't appear to have much impact. So how come you get this self-reinforcing? How come you get this behavior where people would actually say, I want a commission, even though there's a sense that they don't end up with anything? So to me, this says nothing about your first question. It's just, I happen to think of that one. That's kind of an interesting sort of thing that pops up in my mind about that one, to explore that, because that then says something more about commissions and about the way that we deal with all kinds of issues. And you can go back to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Affairs. You could think about the other commission. The one that seems to be slightly different is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it was doing something different, and maybe that's actually the answer to trying to sort out what actually works there or not. But if you wanted to go something on the image side, I think there is really something to do on that front as well.
Flip a coin.
Otherwise, you're on your own.
We're gonna just take a vote here later.
Okay. Always a bad choice to let your peers decide you should do it.
What do you say, sir?
Can I just ask what the word count is?
I have to go back and find out from last year. But someplace in that, about 15 pages kind of structure, maybe 20 pages. I don't want people writing super long essays. I find the more that you can get focused, the more that you're forced to focus, the better the papers are, actually.
Please, my area is...
Do you have a mic? I think it's a long ways away.
Thank you. I'm trying to look at privatization of provincial accounts. And where my interest focus much on is I reviewed Saxtel public account statements and some of the provincial account statements, and I realized that most of them are having huge debt ratio. And most of the time when I read, I also realize that privatization, enough evidence supports that privatization increase efficiency and improve productivity as well as boost the economy of the province. And in order to promote economic growth, I just want to look at from that perspective, that is it prudent to privatize these provincial accounts in Saskatchewan? That's what I'm reading about, because I also read another book about determinants of economic growth, and it actually says that government should limit its expenditure and not to invest in non-productive activity. So if government is investing in this provincial account business, that is increasing, having a high debit ratio, at the end of the day, it doesn't add up to the GDP to promote economic growth.
So, again, I'm going to ask kind of a question that's similar to ones, or make a comment that's similar to ones I've made earlier. The way that you've posed this is you know the answer. It should be privatized, and you're asking sort of specifically why not this one. There's been a lot of debate in Saskatchewan about privatization of crowns, a lot. What you need to know is that in this province, the ability to be able to privatize crowns is at least so far, been something that no government has been able to touch. And particularly, interestingly, of the more sort of the right of center governments. There's many people that believe if there was to be a major privatization, it would have to be done by the NDP, by the more left of center group. Now, the one exception to this is, and this occurred many years ago, was Potash Corp when it was privatized, but that was done by very explicitly giving the Saskatchewan citizens essentially shares in the corporation. So it seems to me if you want to look at the political economic aspects, what you've looked at, what you've just outlined are the economics. You haven't outlined any of the politics. And I don't think that you can, this is a particular problem that you cannot examine without looking at the politics. And understanding what are the mindsets in this province that would be either for or against privatization. So there are norms, there are institutional norms around this issue that you have to understand if you're going to have any discussion of privatization. And you need to link that to the nature of some of the political parties and what they stand for. This is hard for somebody who doesn't know the history of this particular province. Okay. So it would be a good topic, but you would need to really focus your attention away from the economics and really understand some of the political factors that are affecting the economics on this. You also have to, there's a very interesting question on the economic side. It's fairly well known that at least on the telephone side, at least this is what I'm told, people from other parts of Canada will often keep their SaskTel number even when they move someplace else because the rates are lower here than they are elsewhere. So you're focusing on one aspect of the economics, you're not looking at another aspect of the economics, which is the price that people are paying for the services and the kind of services that people are getting. And without a consideration of that, this topic would be woefully underexplored. So all of the, you can come and talk to me about that, but you would need to, find a much sharper question in this, and one that I think delves into the question. And by the way, you need to come back and get at least one of the theories from this course, or a theory from another political economy theory to be able to apply, and I don't see an application of the theory.
Can path dependency be linked to this one? Because not only Saskatchewan, but maybe I could also consider where I'm coming from. Most of the corporations by government are not performing.
So I think that you could. There's probably a very good path dependence argument. You could take your home country and write about that, which you know more about, and try to explain, perhaps the persistence of crowns in your country from a path dependence perspective. That would be that's much more specific. Okay, we haven't quite done everybody else. Who else?
Let's vote.
Yeah.
Just a quick question. I was intrigued by your comment around the fact that the Saskatchewan government of the right would be less likely to privatize than on the left, and I'm not sure I agree with that statement. Or maybe this is a question.
I think what he means is that politically speaking, they couldn't get away with it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas left can get away with it more so because they strictly are more aligned with Crown Corps. And so if they decide to privatize the Crown Corp, they would have a better chance of getting away with it.
I see what you
Politically
mean.
speaking, right?
Because a government from the right would want to privatize more than a government from the left.
But they can't
Yes.
get away with it. Actually.
Yeah.
I like your argument. You might-
Yeah, that's exactly the argument. So, if you think back, the SAS party, when it was first created, Hermanson ran on a platform in that first election that he, as leader, and when he voiced the idea of privatizing, that was the end of his of his run. Wall came in very carefully, not sort of touching that third rail because he knew that it was, and it was only it was interesting. It was only at the end of Wall's term that he mentioned anything about privatization, and even then, it was I think reasonably damaging to him. So I think this is, you're absolutely right. The right would like to, they'd be much more interested in doing this, but for them, the political cost is much higher than for the NDP, where they may be able to say, we agree with this, and we think that this is one of the ones that we could do away with it. It's simply not working.
Some would say that in Manitoba, the NDP lost their next election after amalgamation, but there's probably a ton more reasons. But the fact that they've been there 20 years, but I'm sure that didn't play in their favor.
No, the jury would be out even whether an NDP government could privatize something like a major crown like SaskTel, because it would look like they were giving up their values. So that would be the problem.
Thank you.
While we're in Regina,
I can go.
please.
I'm interested in studying Venezuelan forced migration. So I'd like to explore the contradictory responses that Ecuadorian government is providing to handle Venezuelan immigration in the country. For this purpose, I think institutions will be helpful to understand why, despite the constitutional recognition of free movement and explicit norms that recognize Latin American free movement, Ecuador is imposing restrictions for Venezuelan entrants. And my hypothesis is that beliefs and other implicit norms in the society influence the political decisions. And for this, I was thinking that, of course, I will use institutional theory and also the constitutional approaches that Harding is using in his article.
Yeah, so this is, you've got a really interesting question there. So you're particularly interested in why Ecuador is blocking off people coming from Venezuela. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. There's a number of ways you could tackle that. I think it suggests that some of those norms that you outlined aren't as powerful as they may have appeared to be, right? The norms of free movement within that region weren't actually as strong as people thought. Is there something from the Baumgartner and Jones article about what happened in Ecuador to switch the policy image of immigration from Venezuela to cause them to flip their policy? That would be a very specific way to examine that, and I think could get at some really interesting questions. And then you could talk about why this change in image and venue allowed some of these norms to be overridden when they appeared otherwise to be fairly strong.
Mm-hmm.
But there would be other ways of tackling that. But what's interesting here is that you've got a case where there is a change, and you have to explain why a change occurred, and so you need one of these theories that explains change. And I expect that, I mean, you could give some really deep insight into some of the image things that were going on in Ecuador, some of the things that were being said in the press, and which groups were saying different things about people from Venezuela itself, et cetera. I suspect there's a lot of activity on that image front.
Yep, thanks.
Okay.
So I'm my original question was a little bit too broad, I've realized, in the course of this discussion, so I'm still working to sort of narrow and focus this, and my question sort of emerges out of the discussion that we I think you brought up and that we had last class regarding the extradition treaty with China.
Yep.
So my general question is, how well do theories and mechanics of path dependence explain Canada's behavior regarding the extradition of Meng Wanzhou in this Huawei case? And I think, and I'm still working on the specifics of what I'm going to be looking at, but I'm going to look at whether path dependence applies to, and how well it applies to Canada's behavior in this instance regarding its the underlying institution of the rule of law, as we mentioned last time, as well as the specific mechanism of this extradition treaty. And that's interesting to me in this context because there's, looking at Pearson's factors during this assignment, I didn't discuss this in my assignment, but there was a strong focus on the normative aspect of this case, and there was an alternative normative structure that was put forward by Canada's now former ambassador. So I was just thinking of perhaps looking at how well that theory applied to explaining this situation.
Okay. I think there's something here. I think the idea of rule of law itself is clearly, and I think everybody would argue, or most people would argue, that is heavily influenced by path dependence. That's why it's managed to stay in, as a norm for in sort of the democratic countries for a very long period of time. So I would just say I don't know that you're adding anything there that's kind of new, but maybe there is something that I'm missing. So if you're focusing on the rule of law per se as a norm, I think that's, people kind of understand why that is a long-standing institution. So, I think there is something about I think what you're getting at is that, and this is the Baumgartner and Jones article. We're starting to see it now in the Baumgartner and Jones article, and we're going to see it more in the Thalen article that's coming up in a couple of weeks. So this is a general comment to everybody. What's happening in what happened in institutional theory, and we're going sort of through this ourselves as we work through this. Institutions initially, we painted them to be these things that were impenetrable, that they were kind of all-powerful. They had full force. And now we're starting to see, your example of Ecuador and Venezuela is an example. This particular example, there are, as people sort of wrote about how all-encompassing these institutions were, then another group of people came along and said, yeah, but things change. That institutional theory says things should just kind of remain static. but things change, and why? And the idea is that institutions get created, and they may be created more or less well for this kind of environment, but the environment changes, and the institutions don't quite fit anymore. Even if the environment hasn't changed, the institutions never were quite a perfect fit for the environment in which they were created for. They always miss something, and the reason is because the people that instituted the institutions never had full power to be able to design the institutions completely to the way that they wanted them. They had to always kind of cut corners. And as a result, there were little chinks in the institution that you could find ways in. And Baumgartner and Jones are talking about this. They're saying, so when they talk about institutional venues and being able to switch an issue from one venue to another, they're talking about some flexibility in those institutions. Phelan's going to talk about, she kind of uses the idea of cracks, and you can kind of get in and pry them apart. And so we're starting to now move into a part of the reading list where we're seeing cracks in institutions as a way of getting change to occur. I think what's interesting about this case isn't the rule of law so much, it's that the former ambassador, McCollum, actually started to sketch out an alternative view. Mm-hmm. And I think you want to explore the alternative view rather than the big one.
Yeah. One thing I didn't articulate was that the other way I was sort of looking at it was from the perspective of less of a focus on the rule of law and more of the institutional aspects of Canada's general cooperation with the United States on things like this, because that's a more specific issue that is more easily able to envision an alternative, even though there's a lot of resistance to that through path-dependent mechanisms.
Yeah, and that certainly that would certainly be true. But I think if you think about either spend some time on the U.S. or think about are there some alternatives here, and are they getting what's happening to the image? And maybe this is where the U.S. is playing, is that it's really affecting the image in the venues and not allowing a McCollum-type argument to actually take effect. And so there's an attempt, but then it gets kind of wrestled back. And I think there might be something there. Anybody else at Regina? Did we get everybody? Knowing full well that there is one person left.
Oh, he's sharp.
So I'm thinking if I can get enough research together about investigating the lack of self-government agreements being negotiated in the prairie provinces.
Can you say that again? You were just cutting out.
I'm thinking of investigating the lack of self-government agreements being negotiated in the prairie provinces, but I'm not sure that I can find enough research on that, and also I'm not sure which theory I would use, cooperation or coordination, threat points, I'm not sure.
Yeah, so the other thing is, how do you actually make the claim that there's not very many going on? Is it relative to elsewhere in Canada? Is it relative to some ideal that you might have or somebody else might have? It seems to me that without a really clear benchmark, you're going to have trouble making the case because you have to make the case that there's a lack of, because somebody else could come along and say, well, actually, no, relative to what we might expect, there was actually relatively a large number. So I think that's your first challenge on that. And then and until you get that sorted out and have some evidence one way or the other, I think it's hard to think about a theory.
Although First Nations don't really think they need to negotiate. Anyone who's a member of treaty, so I mean the bands in Treaty 4, the bands in Treaty 6, they see themselves self-governing anyhow, so there's no reason for them to. The reason that White Dakota First Nation which is really one of the only ones here that's successful, did that, is because they're one of the 6, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota bands that were forced to stay in Canada and were pushed up from us. And the reason they did that and decided to negotiate self-government agreement is because they got adhesion to treaty, but they were never going to see the fulfillment of all of the things that the original signatories to 6, to 7, to 8, to 2, to 4, to 3, they don't need them.
Yes.
They are.
So I think you've raised a good point. So part of this is there a negotiation of a treaty, or is it that it was clear that there was a treaty, but were all the lands actually allocated, and does there need to be an additional land settlement? And that could be a separate issue. So I think this needs clarity. Is it about self-governance? Is it about land? Is it about and of course these are connected, but so I'm not saying there's nothing there. I just don't quite know yet what it is. Why didn't you think about it and get in touch with me?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, last few people here, and then we'll take a break. Okay.
So, with respect to the recent iteration of the food guide that was released, looking at what does the image presented, assuming acting as a venue, what does that represent about the changing dynamics of the institutions in Canadian agriculture? Using the theory of Baumgartner and Jones, and possibly considering some indicators of consultation and the section of pie that I'm not sure if anybody's had a chance to take a look at it, but dairy is no longer on there as its own portion of the pie, nor is meat, right? So now it's a protein. So producer groups such as the Cattlemen's Association and Dairy Producers of Canada, obviously, that shifts things for them a bit. I'm maybe not clearly describing what I want to do, but in that.
Yeah, so, this is, Jillian didn't know I was going to use her example when I wrote out the email to everybody, so thank you. But I think this is a really interesting question. The food guide, if you take a look at the new food guide, it's very different than the old one. So here's again, it's back to this thing. Now we're looking at a case where institutional theory says things should stay the same. Institutional theory would have said, and all the power, our theories of power would have said, gee, the food guide should have just stayed the same, except it didn't. How come? I think, Julian, just to be clear here, what you want to look for in terms of image isn't the image that the food guide is presenting. It's what image changes occurred to allow the food guide to change. So what were the images that were about food and about nutrition and about the nature of food that over the last 10 years have changed the power structure of the groups?
Yeah, that the guide is more just a reflection of...
The guide is simply a reflection.
How it has, yeah. It's not dictating what society is going to do, it's just mirroring it or showing something about it.
But more important, if you want to apply Baumgartner and Jones, can you demonstrate? So Baumgartner, if you apply Baumgartner and Jones to the food guide, you would argue that there was a change in the venue and there was a change in the image of food in particular ways. Then if you wanted to show that their theory, so that's what their theory applied to this would say. If you want to kind of prove or disprove, in quotes, their theory, you would want to see if, in fact, you could find evidence that, in fact, there was venue change and there were changes in the image around certain types of food in a way, and that those images were consistent with certain groups then losing favor and other groups having more influence in these venues because of these image changes. And the image changes, remember what Baumgartner and Jones said, that the image changes are about what? Pros and cons. Okay? Are things seen in favorable lights or an unfavorable light? So in their nuclear power example, did it go from nice swirling atoms and creating clean power to, deformities and nuclear wastes and holocausts and so forth like that? Right?
Yeah, and if you look at the consultations that have been done on the food guide this iteration, it's an entirely different consultation process this iteration with which groups they're consulting with.
So the consultations would be part of the. You might argue. This is up to you. You have to make the case. These might reflect changes in venue, because that's actually why these people are invited to the consultations, because the venues have changed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a question of, if you follow Baumgartner and Jones, it's a question of, is there a venue change and is there an image change that led to this final change? That's what you kind of need to do to say, I'm going to try to use this example to kind of prove or disprove, find evidence for, or this is better language, find evidence for or evidence against the Baumgartner and Jones theory. All right. We've got, I think, 2 more left. No, you're auditing. You don't get one. No, it doesn't matter. You don't get one. Got 2 more.
So I was thinking about climate change policy, and I was thinking that we had the Kyoto Agreement and Paris Agreement, and that despite of the environmental changes and different variables, why do we need to keep signing and ratifying new agreements? And I thought maybe that's because those climate change agreements actually induce rent seeking. And I know that most of the countries who sign and ratify the agreements, they are actually introduced different kinds of taxes or subsidies, or, for example, I know that 40 countries introduced a carbon tax, and then there are energy subsidies, energy taxes, emission taxes, so like different kind of taxes, I guess, and then. So I guess it's more about the rent seeking. That's what I was hoping to.
But let me go back to your original thing. So you're right. You're absolutely right. We've had all these agreements. Mm-hmm. What's the simplest question? What's the simplest answer to the question? Why do we have to keep doing new agreements? What's the simplest one?
That's a good question. I guess it's.
What's the simplest answer?
Just to be on the same page, I guess, yeah.
I mean, to me, the simplest answer would be that none of the other ones stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so they're not actually working.
They're not working, so then they have to negotiate another one because the other one didn't work. Mm-hmm. If everybody had followed the Kyoto Agreement, we wouldn't need a new one. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. So I think you need to go back and either try, if you think there's something interesting in that argument, that they just, they just don't work. And the simplest answer to that is, this is just a free rider problem. These aren't binding. But it is really a free rider problem. If that's the case, that's pretty simple. And I think that's probably the norm. That's probably the standard view that people have. So is there anything other than that you could say?
Well, I thought with the constituents of the agreements in induced to rent seeking.
But you're assuming your story assumes that these were that Kyoto was effective and it set up rent seeking and that it caused the next one to. But what if Kyoto wasn't effective at all? Then your story doesn't work.
Well, there were more countries who signed and ratified the Paris Agreement, which.
Yeah, but they didn't even follow through. Because signing is one thing, ratifying is one thing. Actually doing what you promised is the really important thing. Because I go back, the simplest reason, unless you have some other evidence, the simplest reason that people would say, the reason we have all these things is we started off, we set the bar really high, we negotiated Kyoto, didn't work, we signed the Denmark Treaty. Oops, that one didn't work, we signed the Paris Treaty. Oops, that one didn't work, and we keep chiseling away at these until we can find something that somebody agrees to.
Yeah, that's because it's beneficial for stakeholders. So that's what I meant. I meant that actually, because they're not efficient, that actually contributes to the stakeholders. So they can use the agreements.
But there are no agreements. That's my point. Unless the people ratify them, the agreements don't have any force. They're just a piece of paper.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but they are ratified.
No, ratification doesn't matter.
Okay.
It's whether or not those countries actually implement policies that make those things binding on their citizens, cause them to change their habits and so forth. That's what's critical, not ratification. I mean, I think the biggest thing about all these agreements is that we've not lived up to them as a world at all.
Yeah, I guess I'm not conveying my idea, or maybe I'm not understanding the. So I thought that it's actually beneficial for the countries to sign those, even though they're not efficient, even though they're not making any sense, even
But just so you know, that would go against almost everybody else's view of agreements.
It's just a theory. Maybe it's not a good one.
I think you and I should chat about that. Okay. Bianca, you get go.
So generally, for this class, I'm looking at why can't British Columbia, Alberta, and Canada agree on a solution about the Trans Mountain pipeline. And so I guess I've potentially narrowed that down to what incentive structure explains each of those governments' positions on the Trans Mountain pipeline. And I know you said that look at that the Trans Mountain issue in terms of coast, but I was thinking before I came into this class to apply game theory with those as the three players.
Okay. So, I mean, you can certainly do a game theory. If you think back to the stuff that we did on game theory, you have to, in order to construct games, and this goes back to your game that you were looking at as well. The way to construct games is you need to actually ask the question, you have to lay out very clearly what are the strategies for the players, and then you have to think very carefully about I'll just do the 2x2. So if you say have cooperate, whatever cooperate and cooperate are by the two players, you have to then say, okay, that behavior means a certain set of actions. That sort of set of actions would give rise to particular benefits or costs. And then you construct your payoff matrix by seeing what you believe the consequences are of those particular actions. Okay? So this would be the same thing for you with your doctors and your clinics. You would say, here's the strategy for the clinic, here's the strategy for the doctor. If they match up this way, here's the two benefits for each of the parties. If they line up, if they match up in a different way, you get a different payoff. My point is, and maybe I'm going on too much about this, but that has to be done without any idea of what you want for an outcome or what the outcome is. It is as much a independent analysis of what the consequences would be of these particular strategies taken together as you can come up with. And then once you've built the game structure, then to analyze it and see where the parties would end up, given the story that you've told about what the consequences would be of their actions. Okay? So, and I say that because I think all of you, I have this, maybe I'm wrong, so tell me if I am, but I have a bit of a sense that all of you want to construct the game so you get a particular outcome, or make the payoff so that that's the outcome that you want, rather than construct the payoffs as on your best guess of what the real consequences would be if these players had these outcomes.
Yeah, the way I kind of looked at it was just to say, to construct the game as best I could, to say this is why if it matches the position they're in, this is why the position they're in. And then from there, depending on the type of game it is, because I haven't identified that yet, are there common solutions to this particular type of game that we could think about?
Okay, so that works then. Okay, that works very well, because now you've taken what you think the outcomes would be of these actions. As you say, if that matches the current situation, then you kind of got some bit of evidence to say, yep, actually they probably are in this game. They're ending up in this kind of equilibrium. It's going to be difficult for them to get out unless something changes. What could you change about the policies or whatever, so that particular actions would end up giving them different payoffs and then potentially a different outcome that they would choose. Okay. Yep, that works. Good. Let's take a break. We'll be back at 3 o'clock.
Hurry, you still hear us?
Yep. I can hear you.
Perfect. What about now?
Yep. Oh, now try again. No, I can't hear you now.
There you go.
That's why I think it's
I'm pretty sure that's off.
Yeah. Sorry.
we're
We can still hear you.
your supervisor of the committee.
We can still hear you.
It's very important to know that. Yeah, it's very important. You know, it's like you have to talk to your supervisor about that because he's the one who has to find out and then to organize everything. And for example, Bruno was very, very nice. I know he's a very nice I work with her with the project with refugees.
Yeah,
The last class. So she was the coordinator of the project, and she's a professor, and she's very, very good working with refugees in that class. So she's specialized in that. And then she then put on last year.
But I'm trying to get.
That's exciting.
Do you have Kathy McNutt? What part is it for you to reach?
It depends.
You as well? You have Kathy?
No, but Kathy contacted me about something else, and I wrote her back.
Terrible.
She's a lovely person. Yeah, I actually she's a supervisor. Yeah, and you know what? Like, so here's the Kathy is the and she'll tell you exactly. And you'll just walk out. Marlene, who did it last year. She has Kathy as a supervisor. You're kind of on your own, but at the same time.
She's not going to let you bet in.
No, she won't let you bid. So if you're struggling with something, like I just sent her note saying, this is what Bruno said. Here are the things I need to talk to you about. Here's a paper guy. And then Rebecca, her assistant, was that. So just say that.
But that individual behavior ends up giving you something.
She's here next week, so
And
I can find
really
you.
critical.
She's here in the building?
Upstairs.
Like I'm meeting with her on the 19th.
Particular groups take directions and achieve power.
So yeah, like whenever you're around, just say
Other groups.
we had most of my and so it's just I don't know who I want to be the last person to be.
I worry when you then say, when you come in and say,
And then like I think for what I'm doing, I need to understand this policy.
yes, the question
But
of all of these
my issue is not that. You have some
the way the power is working and so forth. And it's all about evaluating.
Or do I really know
And
that?
it's not about evaluation.
And my old supervisor from my master's,
in behavioral stuff that's going on
and
to actually generating this outcome. So
at
if you take
and like if we had all
think
gone
about utilization, what is
very taught in qualitative class last
was
year.
set up by people.
So if we had all been very blessed, we would have
And so then
because Sherry fell over
fair
Sherry didn't even do her
because it ain't your power.
So yeah.
Absolutely.
But you know what I mean? Like so she
I was
kind
Skippy
of
last week, so
Oh,
I know.
really?
That was Wednesday.
Oh.
But I had 1,000 people sing me happy birthday. Who has that?
Lady Gaga. But yeah, so like
Yeah, so but by the way, everybody knows that.
You know, from you
So if we were to change the question,
have some idea, or maybe you would go to know how to
you could
feel.
ask,
Because
is it fair?
one thing I found difficult to find one person that doesn't work the university, you know, like the last person has to be outside the university. I mean, the
Or
university.
is it a matter of self-interest that they're just
So for me, it's not like this lady that I am telling you is the only one that I know outside. And also it's because the topic is very specific and he's specialized in that. So probably if you can call someone that's specialized in that you're gonna like to go with their
I would say,
oh, why are you leaving us? Don't leave us.
most of the state that's been.
It's a chocolate.
yeah, I think
So all the material that, sorry, all the material that's all the composition, all that stuff is on.
So check this out. Yeah. So I got all of
I just find out that that's something that the community, and also that's that is important because they have to give you like it's gonna be 20, whatever, and then that's also important. But it is important for you and also for the estate. So it's like you have to go through all that stuff.
Star Blanket is the game reserve, but this dog is urban. Yeah, this one. That's cheap, I thought.
I can make sure we talk about that.
Who took this in at Starbucks?
When? If there were loans, so like the process is going on the street. So like, yeah, because it takes so long to get it done, right? And that was kind of like.
Like coffee? Do you know that we have a coffee station here?
I heard about that, yes.
Like 3 times now, about land rights, government. I think they are. And actually, that's not new.
Yeah.
Everybody else is doing and like taking out and doing their own land. Everybody is not standard meeting. How is that?
So this process is so interesting because ours is so different in the US. It is so different. But we have a bunch of tribes right now that they to get federal recognition. If you don't have federal recognition,
I think we've been.
unless your state has very, very strong laws. The only way that you have any
Yeah. So when the pipeline wants to go through certain places, they don't have any. There's no, they don't have any. So I'm confused about how to discuss it. Like, so I just want to how would you, in the community that you're talking to, doesn't have
Sorry.
Yeah, for sure.
a Western industrial economic perspective, which is like, it's so weird to read these articles and that's how they talk about.
I get it, but I don't.
I get it, but I hate it. I get angry. I just get angry when I read this stuff. It makes me angry and I just want to like, I'll be writing my notes, I'll be writing, like, obviously, like, this one guy was like, oh, our experience of the land is linked to the land experience of the people around us. Well, of course it is. Like, what is wrong with you?
Or it's like the one pipeline that they want to put through the southwest corner of this province would interrupt the life cycles of all of the animals in the region that go there to give birth.
Yeah.
Like if you put a pipeline through there, you will end all of their chains of existence. Like it's just, and fucking hunters know this. Yeah. Non-indigenous hunters know know why you can't put a pipeline there. And they agree with the First Nations, but we still won't talk about it as this is not Saskatchewan's property. This is, we own this together, and we have an obligation to do something. I don't want to explain how you can take that theory in. Like, then that's why people are protesting, because the conversation is set up for failure.
Well, because there you can't, there's nowhere for you to meet.
Yeah.
There's nowhere for you to meet because you totally fundamentally disagree. You know, so.
Well, you can't even start somewhere on any common ground.
I just can't believe we're still even talking about pipelines as a viable thing. Why are we talking about this? Like, the insects are dying, everything's dying. Oh, he's not going to
Arrange something for Irene? Maybe somebody money, or, you know, what? Can you guys talk about it all?
Not yet. Well, we should, you know, ask her. And then organize. Yeah, what she needs more. Because she's alone here, right?
Maybe, you know, the problem with Sacramento that maybe we can point
Yeah.
a few to
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for your papers. Regina, I've got some of yours. You can give me the rest, and I'll get them in. A couple more things. I want to come back and say a little bit more about what we just did. But before I do that, before I forget, there was a question that one of the people from Regina asked about whether or not we could record the sessions each week from now on and make them available to everyone. And I'm certainly willing to do that, but with a couple of caveats here that I'll describe. I also need your permission to be able to do that on a kind of a wholesale basis. So one of the questions is, if we decided to do this, I would need each of you. I think it would be just enough that if you were to write to me and say that you don't want to have that happen, then we would just not do that. And unless I heard from somebody, we go ahead. Okay? But then I think there's a question of, should we even do this? In one level, at one part of me says I have no trouble with this at all. In fact, in a way, I think it would be very important to do so. I am worried that it would mean that people would just say, oh, you know, I don't have to come today. I think we need, you know, a discussion that goes on in class. And I don't want people to then say, I don't need to be able to come. So that's what I wanted to bring up to the class and just have a bit of discussion on that. So what can you do to convince me that this would be something that you won't kind of free ride on and act opportunistically and say, oh, now I can do something else. I don't have to come to class on Tuesday afternoon.
So, Professor?
Yeah.
Since I'm the one who brought that question forward, why don't I sort of lay out for the class what I was thinking. As you may or may not know, I wasn't in class last week, and I asked permission to have it recorded because I don't necessarily understand all of the material that we cover every week. So missing one class last week due to a provincial convention to which I'm the host would have been nearly impossible for me to attend. So I watched a video on the weekend, and I'll be perfectly honest, the ability to rewind the tape, I'll say, on 50, I'm used to VHS and Beta, the ability to rewind the material and go over it several times. In fact, I took 5 hours to go over the class last week because it just was that helpful. I think the rest of the semester would prove to be that helpful for me in particular. I'll take the blame, but I'm sure, having spoken with some of my colleagues here in Regina, that they too would feel the benefit of that. In terms of your fear of not attending, I think, well, first of all, we have a 10% grade. 10% of our grade is on past participation. I mean, I need all the points I can get, so I'm certainly not going to give up 10% that easily. So I think others would feel the same. And quite honestly, not attending last week, I asked you permission, or advised you anyway, and I think that would be something that you could impose, is that if we're not going to be here, then we should at least have the requirement of letting you know, so that at least you're aware. Again, I think we're all adults. We're all here in our, in a PhD for the most of us. I think we're all fairly mature, and at the end of the day, attending class is an important component of getting through this program. So I don't know that while your fear is, I understand it, I don't think it's necessarily a risk that you need to worry about.
Good, thank you. Anyone else? Other views? As I say, I'm happy to do this. I understand people, there are times when people can't make it. I understand that, and it would be good for that. And I also understand the benefit of being able to go back and look at a couple of things a couple of times to really get it. And for that reason, I support this. I just need to make sure that we've discussed this as a group, and that people are on board. You know, it would be one of the things is, and if you are going to be away, that you do have to get in touch with me. And if you don't, then you know, maybe this is I mean, I don't know what the consequence would be, but if you don't do that and don't have sort of a good reason, then in fact it's spoiled. This would be a tit for tat strategy on a prisoner's dilemma. By the way, what we're looking at is a prisoner's dilemma problem, in case you didn't know. And one of the tit for tat strategies would be, I'll cooperate with you as long as you cooperate with me. And one way of not cooperating is not saying that you're, you know, not doing what was just outlined. In which case, then I just shut it off, and everybody loses.
Plus, it also gives us the opportunity to concentrate more on the discussion rather than taking notes.
That's very true.
There, so I think that's
Yep.
for me, that's the biggest thing.
Yep, very true.
I don't need to write anything. I know I can go back.
Yep. So as I say, I'm happy to do this. I just want to make sure that people are really going to use this fully, to the best way. That's my question. Okay, let me know if any of you don't feel comfortable having this shared. And otherwise, we will go ahead and do this, and I'll get Mandy to post it at the end of each class. Good, excellent, thank you.
I don't agree. Marie, sorry. Sorry. I just want to take advantage that we're talking about these statistics and class stuff. Video conferences are very challenging when you are not into the classroom. And sometimes we really struggle when our classmates in Saskatoon don't turn on their mics. So we really would like you to turn on the microphones when you are speaking, and if it is possible, Murray, if you can please paraphrase what our classmates are saying, that will be easier for us to understand your answers, because sometimes when our classmates turn on the microphone, it's just the halfway, and then we miss the first part, and we miss lost here, and I'm sorry if we interrupt you. We don't want to interrupt you or be unrespectful. We really would like to know what you are saying and be part of the class. So if that could probably be possible, we will really appreciate that.
This is a very good point, and we will redouble our efforts to make sure we use the mics. And I will also try to do some paraphrasing. Just so everybody knows, I have booked in 3 opportunities for me to be in Regina, and so those will take place in March. So you're not going to get me here, you're going to see me in Regina, so we'll flip this whole thing around.
We appreciate, Mary.
I'm sorry?
We really appreciate that. We would like to
access law.
And I'd like to get down and actually interact with you people. But this is very good. The other thing I want to talk about the final, and then let's do that, since that was another question that popped up. We haven't selected a date for the final. This is a big class. Let me tell you what I would have done in another year, in a different year, but I can't. There's no way that I could do it this year. I've typically given an oral exam in this class, and for the oral exam, I would have a set of questions, and people would come in, and I would. It would take about 45 minutes, and I would run through the questions, and I would read them, and then you would respond to them. But if you can just do a quick mental calculation how many hours that would take for me to do 45 minutes with each of you, it's impossible. I can't find that many hours in my schedule. So I think we're back to writing another type of exam. My preference probably is some kind of a take-home, 1 or 2 days, where you would have, or maybe 3-day period which you would get to write this. And I need your view on that. I think that would be my preference over sitting an actual single time where everybody would sit and write. But I need to hear what you would say about that.
No objections?
I agree completely. Just because I find that I need a chance to chew on the information and to stew on it and to reread it multiple times, and I would be challenged, particularly in a time crunch setting, to properly answer the questions, I think.
And anyone else really wants to argue for a sit-down exam at a set time?
No way.
Okay, don't everybody jump up and down at the same time. So we'll then do a take-home. What would be a period that would work for you? And so we're looking at April.
Our last class is the 2nd, right, Murray?
Yes, that is correct.
So I'm a big fan of like wrapping stuff up as soon as possible afterward, because we covered a lot. So, I mean, the way Michael did it, didn't he just, like, right at the end, we had, like, 3 or 4 days?
Yeah, I could, so then there's also the term paper, which we could do later in the term. We could, the class wraps up on the 2nd, April 2nd. I could send something out the next day, and it could be due by, we could do it Friday. It could be due by Friday, or is there a group of people that would prefer to have it over the weekend, in which case I could send it out Thursday or Friday and have it due first thing Monday morning. What's people's preference?
Friday.
I personally, I would think over the weekend would be better, but some might be complicated. So I mean, It's gonna be hard to please everybody on this one.
Yeah, I'm of the opposite that we
do
don't.
Friday.
Yeah, do Friday just because.
I could do a doodle poll and see how many people would prefer. Now we know that no method of voting is going to be completely fair, right? Or particularly representative of the view of the views of the group, but nevertheless, we could do just a, and I could send out a doodle poll, and just it would be, I think, those two choices right away after the final. Put it this way: how many people would, just show of hands, how many people would prefer it right after the last class? Okay, and how many people would prefer it then over that next weekend? And how many of you didn't vote? Okay, this is too hard to tell, I think. Any other suggestions for timing?
So how about you give it out at the end of the last class and it's due next Monday? Yeah.
That is a possibility. How about that? The suggestion was give it out at the end of or soon after the last class, maybe sometime on the Wednesday, and then it is due Monday morning. And if you want to hand it in sooner, you can do that. And if you want to take time over the weekend, you can do that.
That works great. That sounds
That's
great.
a great solution.
Very good. Okay. Wonderful. Wow, that was easy.
When is the paper/poster going to be due, or are they due at different times?
No, so I need to find out the information about the poster and when it's due, and I have to find. I have to go digging, and I will do that and send that to you, so you know that over the break. But it'll be roughly the middle of March, or near the end of March. So there'll be 3 sort of deadlines coming up. They'll all be in March, or 2 of them will be in March. You'll have an initial overview. So this was great today, and I want to come back and talk about this. But there'll be an initial statement of your research topic, kind of a draft poster. Let's call it that, a draft poster. Then there's the poster itself, and then there's the term paper. And the poster itself will be sometime near the end of March, just in time so that I can choose the winners that would go on and are going to present at the Tansley. And so there's just enough time to get the posters printed and so forth for the Tansley. And then you would have time then after that to take that material that was on the poster and put it into a term paper. And that term paper, of course, would not happen then until after the midterm was due. Sometime well into. So I'm just looking at April. Something like maybe the 21st or the 22nd. The 21st is a Sunday, and I have it due late on the 21st. So that gives you another couple of weeks after your midterm or your final exam is over to put the final touches, and then the poster would be due sometime near the end of March, with your draft poster due a little bit before that. How does that sound? Yes.
The questions on the final exam, will they be in the similar format to the assignment questions that we've had the last couple of assignments, the problem sets? Is that kind of what?
I need to think about this. There will be. I'll have a mixed. So the problem sets have been a single question. And what I would do is have smaller, and they've been fairly large, taking at least a week to kind of do. These would be smaller questions, and there would be more of them. So I'm expecting that there will be something like 3 or 4 or 5 smaller questions that require you to deal with the material. That's my guess. Okay. Good. Let me just say just something about what we did here in the first half of this class. I want to say thank you to all of you for sort of being willing to subject yourself to this of having somebody just going around the room and having to come up with your term paper topic and then I'm just throwing my comments back at you. I know this can be difficult, but I thought I just want to say that the set of questions that you're coming up with are really good. Okay, I always find this with the students in this class, the questions that you are inherently interested in are really fascinating ones, and they go from very big to very small and everything in between, and it's great. And there is always a really good political economy angle to them. The stage that you all are at is also very, very common for this class. That you're still kind of struggling with what is the question I want to ask. What is it, and I'm going to come back and answer this a little bit more, what is political economy? You're still kind of not really sure about what that is. You're not really quite sure what I want and what you should be presenting to me. So I just want to say I thought you guys did a really good job. I was very pleased. I would have, as I was going through, interestingly, as we were going through, I was making the point that, this question related to this reading and this question related to that reading. I would have loved to be able to, and maybe I'm not being creative enough, but I would have loved to have been able to do this kind of thing earlier and deal with the readings by going around and asking questions of you about things and saying, but do you see how this particular question or this particular reading feeds in? The problem that I think, and maybe again I'm not looking at this right, but until about this place in the course, I don't think that you have enough sort of theories at your fingertips to be able to do what we did today. If we had tried to do this earlier in the term, we would have had COAS, and everybody would have said COAS, and that would have been it. But now we can do COAS, and we can do path dependence, we can do coordination games, we can do Baumgartner and Jones, we can talk about shifts in default values, and that's the game that's being played. We have a much richer vocabulary to actually have these conversations. But I do wish that there was a way of having a conversation like the one we had today every day. Now, I do want to say just a little bit, and I want to open this up for questions. I want to say just a little bit about what political economy is, because I think people are still sort of struggling with this. And here's my view on this. And I can tackle this in a couple of ways, but it is, I said at the beginning of term, and I still believe this, it is about two fundamental questions. How do you make the pie grow, and how is the pie divided? Those are the two fundamental questions that you can't separate, and they are inherently part of, this is what makes political economy. The economics part is how do you get the pie to grow, and the political question is how do you divide it up. And those two things, I hope you see, are fundamentally linked. And you can't separate them. And all kinds of economists and political scientists have tried to separate those two things, and you can't. And I think this is what I'm hoping the readings are pointing to, kind of at a very, very high level. Okay? So that's one view of what political economy is. Another view of political economy is to go back to that very first reading that you did. And that it was the part of that first assignment. And that is Acemoglu and Robinson's framework that they sketched out in that chapter in the handbook, where you had a dynamic process of groups with de jure or de facto power being able to then set the terms of the political institutions. And the political institutions determine the economic activity, the economic resources. And those in turn coming back and determining the de jure and de facto power. The decisions that people make about institutions affecting both the political institutions directly as well as the economic institutions. The economic institutions determine the amount of money, resources that people get. The political institutions and the economic resources feed back in and determine de jure and de facto power in the next period, which then sets the whole thing off again. That's the model that I think about all the time. Okay? And it is a dynamic one. It is one in which there's a constant dynamic that's at work where people with power, with de jure and de facto, and we haven't talked about what the difference is between de jure and de facto, though by now you should be getting an idea. De jure power shows up in institutions, right? It shows up in having control of the courts and the policy regimes and so forth, and it shows up, de jure power also in a way shows up in some of the just norms of behavior. De facto power is what you're able to get because you can mobilize your resources at a particular point in time and lobby effectively or change the image of an issue or change the venue because you have de facto power. Okay? Those things end up changing the institutions, and Acemoglu and Robinson are very, very clear. The reason you want to change the institutions is because they are sticky. They stick around. And they then can have impacts into the future. When you lose your de facto power, you can retain your de jure power through the institutions. Institutions are this way of converting de facto power to de jure power. Okay? And we need to understand that. And what we now understand is that they do that by setting up norms of behavior, but they also reset the terms of the bargaining that would subsequently occur afterwards. So they are setting the threat points for the subsequent behavior. And so not only are you taking de jure power and your de facto power and wanting to set up institutions for the sake of retaining power, but you want to enhance your power by changing those default values. Okay? And as you set up those institutions, it sets up the framework for the kinds of Coasian bargains that we were talking about. If the transaction costs are low enough, it sets up the framework for those, but we have to worry about free rider problems in particular. Okay? Meanwhile, you've got this dynamic of coordination games going on, particularly in terms of thinking about feedback effects and how there's the stability in institutions and regimes going forward. And we had a couple of examples of this today where you get these self-reinforcing behavior where there's an expectation that this is the kind of environment you're going to create, and that creates incentives for both players to do certain things which actually reinforces that particular outcome. And so, Meraldi, your example of the commissions is a case of that. And it's a neat example of that kind of dynamic at work. Okay, but then what we also understand, and this is where the de facto power comes in, is that institutions aren't perfect, and we're starting to, and I've talked about that earlier. So, but all of this system that's going on is fundamentally addressing these two critical points. Is the pie getting bigger, and how is it getting shared? Okay? Because that's ultimately, it appears to be the two things that drive us as humans. One more thing to add, and then I want to open this up for your comments. If you think back to the comments that I was making about, and you can think about your particular question. In most of the instances, what I was trying to get you to think about is a causal story or a causal relationship. Okay? And that causal story or that causal relationship occurs because of behavior of individuals or groups or entities within the political economic system. And the way I want you to think about the world is that the outcomes we get are the result of these behaviors of different groups. Okay? And these behaviors may be motivated by, maybe people being motivated by self-interest, maybe people motivated by strong identities that they hold, maybe people motivated by norms of behavior that have been passed down from previous generations, saying this is how you should behave. It may be identities that you have. If you go back to the Bartels and Aiken and Bartels piece, it may be behavior induced by reports of shark attacks. Okay? Any of this behavior is fair game, but what is the behavior of these groups and individuals that is out there? And what does that behavior lead to? What kind of consequences does it have? And this is now, particularly for the people doing their MPP and the PhD, what you're looking for in your research is in one shape or form, and it takes, I'm going to use a particular language, but you can modify this, depending. But you're looking to kind of test a prediction of that behavior. You have a theory, and these theories that we have are all about how we expect people to behave. This is the key thing about the theories, is that it's all about how we expect individuals, groups, certain entities, or groups of entities when they interact. How do we expect them to behave? And in one way or another, what we're doing in our dissertations and our theses is to, and I'm going to put quotes around this, test these theories, test these predictions. Can we say that in this particular situation, do we have some confidence that we think this particular theory, this particular set of dynamics around behavior is the one that's driving this particular scenario? And why do we care about that? Because if we think that that's the case, then we have this hope that we can use that knowledge and that prediction in other scenarios kind of like it to make some prediction about an outcome. And that we believe that that's important in terms of kind of understanding how the policy process might work. how it might unfold? Can we make predictions about how the policy world might unfold? Or if we think that this is the behavior, can we alter the behavior in some way to get a different result? Those are the reasons that we as academics are interested in this. But fundamentally, we as academics, I think, are interested in, there's a behavior, can we actually understand what that behavior is? So there's something else that's going on that in this class that cuts across all the social sciences, and that is understanding behavior of individuals. And you can't think about political economy without that. And in fact, that's the driver of this dynamic that's always at work, churning out different allocations of benefits in different sizes of pies is the behavior. It's what makes this thing work. Okay? So for me, that's political economy. It's bringing the economics, which is, gee, is the pie getting bigger? How much, and then how much do I get of it, which is the politics. And I might not care about making the pie bigger if I can get a bigger share of it. Okay? And that may be good for me, but it's not good for everybody else. And we care about that, I think, fundamentally, as policy. Your turn. I've talked way too much. Comments, thoughts?
I have a question.
Yes.
Just about property rights. When we're discussing property rights, and who has property rights, and how does that play out? And we kind of allude to it when you talk about pipelines and that sort of thing, but not everybody has the same concept of property rights. So I'm wondering how you look at that when, one concept of property rights is, legal and granted under legal sort of systems, and
right.
Land is very different. Like, how do you compare things that are fundamentally uncomparable? That's why people are protesting.
So you're absolutely right about the non-comparability of the things that people are concerned about. Let me take you back to what I said that very first class. My definition of what I said Coase was talking about when he was talking about property rights, he's talking about essentially the right to be able, it was a decision right, the right to be able to make a decision on that particular issue. And for me, so you can think of property right as being the right to a piece of land, but really, that's, I think, what a lot of people would think, or you own a house, okay, or you own a car. But if you think about it, really what your right is the right to be able to make a decision about who comes into your house, who can drive your car, who could, what could be done on your land. It's really decision rights that we are really deciding. And if we open it up and think about property rights as decision rights, now we can think about pipelines where property rights doesn't quite do it. Okay? But decision rights definitely work. Because if you think about what's going on between the Alberta government, the federal government, the BC government, some of the First Nation groups, the environmental groups, they are all saying, I want the right to decide what's going on this pipeline. That seems to me to be what everybody is fighting over. So actually, I think there's a great deal of agreement over what the thing is that they're kind of fighting over, and that is the right to decide. Each of them then wants to use that right to decide for very different purposes. And they think that their purpose is bigger and better than anybody else's purpose. But if you think about it that way, there really isn't much difference between the federal government and the Stolo tribe in the Fraser Valley versus the BC government versus say the Green Party. These people all are saying we want more of a right to decide. Does that help?
Actually, yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
And what I want you to connect back then is that right to, this is kind of interesting. If you think back to Mo's example his example of the thief coming up to the person on the street. And there's, you can think of there being two scenarios. One is there's no thief. The pedestrian just keeps walking. There's nobody there. And the other one is the thief appears and is brandishing the knife or the gun. In those two situations, what it really is a right to decide. Does this person get to walk down the street without being accosted? Actually, do they have to decide? Are they given that decision? Either it's my life or my wallet, and they've given up a whole bunch of choices. When you move away from this scenario to this scenario, there's a different set of choices, and you could think about that as essentially a right, a decision right. They don't have as many decision rights in this case as they do in this case, and the point to make is that when you change decision rights, you change your default value. And this is what COAS, this is one of the things that comes out of COAS as well, is that those two people had very, I'll put it this way, when, if you go back to the example that we had, when the confectioner could decide whether or not, when they had the right to decide whether or not they could operate their machine or not, that gave them access to a particular benefit. And if they didn't have that right to decide, it was given to the doctor, all of a sudden the confectioner no longer has that right to that thing, that particular payoff. Now somebody else has that right to that payoff, and it changed their default value as a consequence. So let me ask people. I know this. A number of you have commented about how abstract some of this is. What I was hoping to do with the term paper and hoping to do this morning is to connect this up. Do you start to see the connection between, are you starting to see the connection between the theories, which I agree are abstract, and they have to be, because I think what we were seeing this afternoon is that they can apply to very, very different situations. It's just a question of being able to interpret that situation through the lens of a particular theory. But how are you feeling now about this abstract nature of these theories? What are people thinking?
So in terms of the abstractness of these theories, the biggest problem is that I haven't seen enough in terms of the methodology of how they're actually applied. Like what sort of sources can you use that will give you the information to let you fill in the blanks that these theories create? Where do you find the meaning to give them substance?
Yes.
So that's the biggest problem right now.
Yeah. So that's a very good comment. For some of them, you do get the articles do provide a bit of a sense of this. So the Baumgartner and Jones article, for those of you who haven't read the whole thing, if you are thinking about using the idea of policy images in policy venues, read the last part of their paper, which you might be tempted to skip over, which is their whole example of a case, nuclear power, where they very systematically go through and document how they could use their theory to examine this particular case. And in a way, Aaron, the answer to your question is the way that I learned and all of us learn how to apply these theories is to read what other people have done and try to learn from the process that they've gone through, and then to actually try it yourself. And this is why we have. This is what I'm trying to do with this particular term paper. So I'm trying to give you an opportunity to do that application, recognizing, and I said this at the very beginning, I recognize that for many of you, this is the first time that you will be asked to do this. Okay? Because this is not what you've learned in, for those of you coming out of undergrad programs, this is not what you've been taught in undergrad programs, is to do this kind of application. So I would say almost all of you have very little experience at doing this. And I think I need to give you probably even more than what I have been giving you. But the other thing is, don't be too hard on yourself, because you're learning, and this is the stage that you get to try this out for sort of for the first time. And all of us did that. I can remember my first very tentative steps towards this, and guess what? It happened in my master's program as well, where I finally, somebody said, "Okay, Murray, you get to do this," and I go, "What?" At this, at that point, up until that point, and I've actually written a little bit of something on this, thinking about this. The way I characterize my undergrad program, maybe I'm completely wrong, so tell me if I am. I characterized my undergrad program, I was, for the most part, a consumer. I mean, I wrote essays, but really I was a consumer. I was taking and just repeating somebody else's theory. I wasn't trying to think about how a particular theory could apply to a problem that I was interested in. I was not thinking about that. And in order to do that, you have to go from being what I call a consumer of theories, where you're just kind of eating up theory after theory after theory. You have a whole list of things that you've studied, but you don't really know any of them particularly well, to being able to produce something where you say, I'm going to take this theory and I'm going to delve into it, and I'm going to understand. Remember I said that inside each of these theories there's a causal story? What you need to do is understand that causal story. And if you think back to the questions that I was asking every time we took up a paper, the questions I was always trying to get you to go at were, what's the causal story? Don't tell me what the theory tells you. Don't tell me, Coase's theory is about property rights. That doesn't do us any good. Okay? Coase's theory is, you have people with this particular configuration of property rights. What happens? What's their incentive to bargain? If they bargain, what will the outcome be? How does the starting point for their bargain affect the outcome? Can you trace that through? If you can, you understand the dynamics, and you have the start of a theory that you can put into a much larger context. Okay? So all of this is understanding that causal story that is fundamentally behavioral, and then being able to say, I want to see if I can't find this in this instance, this example that I think is interesting. Can I sort through that causal story? Now, what's absolutely true is that there will be more than one causal story that will make sense for that particular thing that you're observing. Okay? And I completely agree with that. But I don't want you chasing three things. I don't even want you chasing two things. I want you chasing one. Because I want you to understand that causal theory well enough so you can start to see some of the insights that come from doing that. And believe me, this is the funny thing. Once you start to understand a theory really well and really understand these behavioral aspects that are required to make it work, you're going to see a richness to it that you never thought existed. And you will then start to see things, you'll say, there's something there. I wonder if that's present in my case. And it causes you to look at your case in a completely different way because you're looking for things that you didn't know that you were looking for. And I hope that all of you will come out saying, holy smokes, I learned something about my case that I didn't know was even there. And I will submit that you will only be able to do that if you can focus just on one theory rather than trying to do multiple ones. Who else? Anybody else?
I think that sometimes what is very challenging, I guess for me, is just sometimes understanding the basic assumptions that are being made, because then if you don't get the assumptions right, then you realize that that theory actually will not apply to the problem that you think should apply to. So I think that especially with these readings, what I really, really find challenging is just understanding the basic assumptions that these authors are making, even before the application of the theory. So I don't know how sometimes, I think for me, I guess that's why I don't really want to miss a class, because it's through the engagement that I really get to understand what is really happening. I guess how to get the basic assumptions being made in these articles.
So
how that applies to you.
So this is a great question. You're absolutely right to focus on the assumptions. If you think about these papers, it is the assumptions that start this behavioral dynamic. And one set of assumptions will lead to one behavioral dynamic, a different set of assumptions will lead to a different behavioral dynamic. The Downs article for this week is a great case in point. This is why I keep wanting to assign it, is because, and you saw the same thing in Coast. Downs starts off by saying, if you assume that there is perfect information, what conclusion does he come to after he works through what the implications of perfect information? What's the implication of perfect information?
No actor can be persuaded.
I guess that.
No actor can be persuaded, and then there's something else that. Go ahead, Esther, and hit your.
I was just going to say that. So with him, what I got was like, if you think that everybody's votes count, then you're really wrong. You're mistaken.
Right. So this is the key thing. If you had perfect information, then Downs says every person's vote counts. You can't ignore one person's vote because at the expense of somebody else's, because every vote actually counts. But then he changes his assumptions and says, but now suppose we don't have perfect information. And the consequence of that, and he works it through, and we should actually take the time to understand that argument. But the conclusion is, bingo, now there are some people's votes that don't count, and there's other people's votes that count a lot. And it stems solely from the assumption that there's no longer perfect information. This is huge. Okay? And so then we have to ask ourselves, which kind of a world are we in? Well, we're obviously, and there's no question, Downs understands we're in the second world. We're in the second world, so there are some people's votes that don't count nearly as much. And there's other people's votes who count a great deal. But what Downs is good, but that framework is so good for is to say, we now can kind of isolate the reason for that. That's where the understanding assumption isn't just a case of understanding the assumption, it's understanding that's actually the source of this different dynamic is that information. Because it's the thing that sets off a different causal connection between all these things. Who else?
In terms of the definition about political economy, so we have said that the economics aspect is concerned only how to grow the pie. Does that mean they are less interested in the distribution aspect, or?
Sorry?
Does that mean the economists are less interested in the distribution?
Yep. Economists typically are less interested in the distribution. Political scientists, on the other hand, are more interested in the distribution. They tend to think about the conflicts that then occur because of concerns over the distribution. Economists then tend to think, and you saw that in the Mo article, where you have these economic theories that are all about trying to get cooperation where both parties benefit. So if you have a situation where both parties benefit, the pie is getting bigger. There's no ifs, ands, buts, or maybes. That's a consequence of if both parties are benefiting, the pie is getting bigger. And so economists tend to focus on that. And this is why Mo's article is really good at sort of talking about this, because the economists then have, up until now, have tended to focus on this period after the property rights have been defined. And is there then an incentive to create arrangements then that would allow each of them to do even better than what the property right assignment would have created? And the answer is clearly yes. What we know from the prisoner's dilemma is that there may be benefits to cooperating, and you may not be able to get there unless you can somehow overcome the free rider problem or that prisoner's dilemma. And then we may need something like norms to be able to accomplish that. That's a critical part of the story. Okay, and this is Douglas North's point, is that the economies that have done particularly well have been able to set up things where there's lots of benefit, there's lots of opportunities for people to make mutually beneficial moves, and there's been a system in place that would support those mutually beneficial moves so that people have an incentive to do that. And so the pie has actually got quite a bit bigger. But Mo says, don't forget that there's a pre-stage to that. And Asimoglu and Robinson recognize that there's a pre-stage to that. That's this whole diagram that they've got mapped out, where there's a competition over how those initial setups are determined. And that those are equally, those may in fact be the big point where the political duels are going on, the political battles are going on, trying to influence what's that institutional setup, so that I'm in a better position once the decision has finally been made. And so, back to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, that we are clearly in that pre-stage where the property rights have not been defined. Okay? And people and all the parties in that dispute are trying to take us back and put us back in that realm. Okay? Even though the federal government had thought that it had sort of got the legislative framework in place that would establish the rights, the BC government was challenging that. And some of the environmental groups are challenging that and saying, no, there's another way to to think about this particular problem. Those property rights aren't settled. We want to go back to this pre-stage.
On that example, does that sort of speak to the dynamic that that assignment that we handed in was getting at? That even though there can be changes in the formal institutions, in the de jure power, the norms will take a while to catch up to that if they do at all, and that can hinder. And that plays back into the political duels, as you said, between one party having a view that this is established and other parties attempting to go back to the drawing board.
Yep, exactly. It's time we left. I found this really good, folks. Thank you. What I want to do, this is a turning point. We got a break next week. We come back. This has always been the case in this class. There's a very different, speaking of dynamics, there's a very different dynamic in this class before the break versus after the break. Okay? You have now, there's a few more theories that we need to look at. Okay? Some rent-seeking stuff, some of the stuff on corruption, Thalen, but you're now getting you're starting to get roughly sort of the landscape. What I want to do, and what I want to challenge you to do, is I want to increasingly have conversations about what are these cases that we are seeing in the news today, how do they fit into this framework? Okay, so we can make this less abstract. Okay, and you need this because this feeds into your term paper as well. Have a great break. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
I mean, whatever it is.
I also like.
Okay. You're not.
Once you have maybe some drain, financial drain.
I'll just. Oh yeah, no. That's exactly. I think we still figure out. Change the parameters. First, ask yourself.
But then if
who you were. To what extent did practice the arrangements all the applicants
yes, and then I think we should just ask her, I don't know what we need, and then another the problem is she and then if she says this doesn't
It seems fascinating to me.
Yes.
I've only gone a few times in my life, and not exceptional. I mean, I have some basic coordination that helps, but Tough to hit. I don't know. I've only got one time. Oh, wait. I don't know. I've always had fun when I did it.
I mean,
Interested in trying.
not really a big, like,
How about you?
I can try.
Did you go out there or just get away? Just get away.
I was just like, but you can't.
Slightly warmer.
And
Yeah, sure. I'd still take that over what we had here, I think. Hopefully it'll warm up for you.
In general. Okay.
I hope that's. Yeah. What was that?
Right away. I guess. You know, break is one of the classes.
I don't think it's.
Schedule it in there.
I was just at the beginning of the show.
I guess it's not
Well, I hope that's not. Yes. What she's doing on this association is very interesting.
I know what I said.
That's her. Not her guy. I'm like, dude, I don't know.
20 emails a day.
And I also received national students. The one that it goes today.
Yeah.
I saw that too. Why did I get that?
Oh, but I just find it fascinating.
Mine.
I didn't go through it, but I just was like, oh, what did
I
I
know
go
it's
through that? I wanted to.
I'm going to just do the dating in Canada one.
You know, romantic dating.
Wait a second. There we're all going.
Pregnant.
I have theoretical stuff.
Sorry. Think about that. Okay. And then one shot. I'll send you an email.
Please, can I do a review?
At least you've done a lot of it.
Yes. Send me.
Yeah, I just want to do
Send me.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow.
It took me surprised that next week is really weak.
Yeah.
I was like thinking next 2 weeks. So actually the finance page is academic and week.
We have received the answers.
Oh, I haven't checked my mail. How was it? You went through?
Yeah, I also. I think we fine.
We did a great job, right?
I didn't see much mistakes.
Oh, you know so.
I mean, more or less we're fine.
Por algo súper económico. Hicieron ya las clases.
Auditing this course.
Porque hice para mí es un
Today I slept like 3 a.m. Woke up 5 a.m. Sit down.
cuatro condiciones.
Hey. I had an option. I was like, I'm using this as an authentication. Oh, good. Because if you have a class tomorrow, like a day before and the next day is so tight. Doing assignments, presentation, writing.
Assignment and presentation.
I don't like it. Even this Monday, Wednesday is good.
Originally serious. Ever work with people? treat their work. It's all theoretical.
Yes,
But
and then that's what I'm very worried about the exam. Yeah. Because all these readings and stuff, they're going to be exams. So I wonder what do they expect from us?
You know what though? You know what I was thinking? Is this is going to be like, it's going to be very much like Michael's.
Yep.
Like Michael's exam, which was hard, but it wasn't impossible. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't impossible because you had those questions. So if you're very, very familiar with a number of the theories, like I think that you'll be okay.
But then, for example, for the assignment, I was wondering, because there's a lot of this Nash equilibrium stuff, coordination games, theory games and everything. So, like, do they expect us to put that in the exam? Because, for example, for me, this Nash equilibrium stuff is like, okay, that can work paper, cannot. That for me is not real work, Like, that's a kind of interpretation that you do when you want to interpret something in a theoretical way.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not the other way around, because it's not that the theory is applying for the real world. It's you are interpreting something through a theory. For me.
Yeah.
So when I was doing the assignment, do they expect us? Because we're talking about that the whole time, and I like theory games. I really like them in the theory. Like it's the way you interpret things, and that's it. But then if you ask me, it's like, no, it's not the way that things work.
Exactly. So then I feel no motivation to really look at it because it doesn't apply.
It doesn't apply, yeah. And I feel the same. So it's like, when I'm thinking about all this, for example, all these Venezuelan laws and everything. No, it can't be seen through the eyes of coordination games. You are missing the whole context, for me. So it's like, probably what I have to do is to learn how to say things in a way that I can pass the exam, And then do the research the way that I feel.
But didn't you think what he said about institutions? Didn't you like that applied?
That applied, and that I like that part, because I feel that's the part that I'm going to use.
Yeah.
And then I haven't seen the offer that you mentioned. Actually, I haven't read that much. Yeah. But of course, my point, and I feel like the same will go well if I, apply this kind of why the images changes and everything, and that will be fine. But then I'm pretty worried about the exam, like final exam, the type of questions that they will do.
Because if we're using it to apply something that is useful or interesting to us, but then on the exam, do they want us to just
just to apply exactly? So when I was doing the assignment, I was thinking probably we will have to learn how to respond to that questions, just to be practical, Because at the end, what would matter is, for me, what matters is the research, what you will do later and that stuff. But if they are expecting us to have some questions, we just have to learn how to answer that.
Well, and that's what I was telling my supervisor is like these classes, like I would have liked to take one of these, and then nosotros sobre cosas indígenas. Claro que para mí, eso tiene como más asunto de lo que yo voy a hacer. Pero tengo que tomar las cosas. Sí. ¿Para qué?
En fin, ya aprenderemos.
Chao, Pau. Cuídate mucho.
Bien. ¿Te vas a algún lado la próxima semana?
Creo que es posible que vamos por un lugar que se llama Nest Creek.
Ay, qué chévere.
Sí, para, no sé cómo se dice, es como cabin. No sé, como una finca.
Ah, qué lindo.
Sí.
Chévere. Oye, pero nos vemos el viernes igual.
¿El viernes?
Ah, sí. Sí, yo biblioteca.
Sí, yo me voy después de mi reunión acá.
Chévere. ¿Y va a ser acá en la